Something was coming toward his ranch, and whatever it was carried the weight of consequence. The dust cloud on the horizon looked wrong. Too thick, too organized, too deliberate for a cattle drive or supply wagon. Samuel Creek had seen enough trouble in his 42 years working this unforgiving stretch of Colorado territory to recognize the signs. But let's back up 18 hours, because what happened the day before would change everything. Samuel thought he knew about right and wrong, about enemies and friends, about the thin line between mercy and catastrophe. The morning started like any other on the Creek Ranch. Samuel was mending fence posts near his water trough when he spotted movement in his peripheral vision. A small figure stumbled across the dry grassland, weaving like someone fighting against invisible hands. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal, maybe a calf separated from its mother. But as the shape drew closer, Samuel's blood turned cold. It was a child, a Native American girl, couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, dressed in traditional clothing that had seen far better days. Her tiny frame swayed with each step, and even from 50 yards away, Samuel could see the desperation in her movements. She was heading straight for his water source. Every instinct Samuel had developed during 2 decades of frontier living screamed at him to reach for his rifle. Relations between settlers and the local tribes had been tense for months. Just last week, the Johnson family 3 miles south had found their livestock scattered and their barn burned to the ground. The territorial marshal had blamed renegade war parties, and fear had settled over the region like morning fog. Most ranchers wouldn't hesitate. They'd see a native child on their property and assume the worst. Trap, ambush, reconnaissance for a larger attack. The smart move, the safe move, would be to drive her away with warning shots. Or worse. But something stopped Samuel's hand before it reached his weapon. Maybe it was the way she stumbled, like someone who hadn't seen food or water in days. Maybe it was how small she looked against the endless expanse of prairie grass. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that reminded him of his own daughter who died of fever 3 winters ago. The girl collapsed near his water trough, her small hands clawing at the wooden sides, trying to pull herself up to reach the liquid inside. She was too weak, too exhausted from whatever journey had brought her to his ranch. Samuel watched her struggle for maybe 10 seconds before his conscience overruled his survival instincts. He set down his tools and walked slowly toward her, hands visible, movements deliberate and non-threatening. As he got closer, he could see the full extent of her condition. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Her dark eyes were sunken, too large for her thin face. Whatever had happened to bring her here, she was dying. Samuel knelt beside the water trough and filled the wooden ladle they kept hanging there. The girl's eyes tracked his every movement, wide with fear and desperate hope. When he brought the ladle to her lips, she drank like someone who'd been wandering the desert for weeks. 3 ladles. 4. 5. Samuel kept refilling and offering water until the girl's hand stopped shaking enough to hold the ladle herself. Only then did he really look at her clothing, at the intricate beadwork on her small vest, at the patterns woven into her dress. His neighbor Pete Morrison had described those exact designs just 2 weeks ago during a town meeting. Samuel's stomach dropped. If Pete was right, this wasn't just any native child. The beadwork, the specific patterns, the ceremonial nature of her clothing. This was someone important. Someone whose disappearance would be noticed. Someone whose presence on his ranch could bring the kind of trouble that ended with graves and burned homesteads. But it was too late to change course now. The girl had finished drinking and was looking up at him with something that might have been gratitude. Samuel could see intelligence in her dark eyes, awareness that went beyond her years. She understood that this white rancher could have killed her, could have driven her away to die on the prairie. Instead, he'd shown mercy. Samuel helped her to her feet and guided her toward his cabin. She could barely walk, leaning heavily against his leg with each step. Inside, he settled her into his only comfortable chair and moved to prepare food. The stew from last night was still warm on the stove, and he had fresh bread cooling on the counter. As the girl ate, Samuel found himself studying her face, trying to read the story written in her expression. How had she ended up alone on the prairie? Where was her family? How long had she been wandering without food or water? And most importantly, what would happen when her people came looking for her? Because they would come. Samuel was certain of that. A child this young, dressed in ceremonial clothing, didn't just wander away from her tribe without consequences. Someone would be searching, and that someone would eventually follow her trail straight to his front door. The girl finished eating and curled up in the chair, exhaustion finally overtaking her small body. Samuel covered her with his only blanket and tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing. But as the afternoon shadows grew longer across his property, doubt began creeping in like winter cold. That's when he heard the sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, riding hard across the prairie, coming from the direction the girl had traveled. Samuel moved to his window and peered through the glass, his heart hammering against his ribs. 5 riders crested the hill overlooking his ranch, moving in formation that spoke of military precision. Even at this distance, Samuel could see they weren't soldiers. These were tribal warriors, and they were heading straight for his property with the kind of purpose that usually ended in bloodshed. Samuel glanced back at the sleeping girl, then at his rifle hanging above the fireplace. He could wake her, try to explain through gestures that her people were coming. He could hide her in the root cellar and pretend he'd never seen her. He could even lie, claim she'd stolen water and food before disappearing again, but looking at her peaceful face as she slept. Samuel knew he couldn't do any of those things. Whatever happened next, he'd face it with the truth. He'd helped a dying child, and he wouldn't apologize for that, not even if it cost him everything. The riders were close enough now that Samuel could see their war paint, could make out the weapons they carried. His hands shook as he stepped outside to meet them, leaving his rifle behind. If these warriors had come for blood, a single gun wouldn't save him anyway. The lead rider was a man Samuel recognized from descriptions he'd heard in town. Tall, imposing, with silver streaking through his black hair and scars that spoke of countless battles. This was Chief Running Bear, the most feared war leader in the territory, the man who'd united 3 separate tribes under his command, the man whose daughter had been missing for 4 days, because that's who Samuel had saved. Chief Running Bear's only child, the future of his bloodline, the most precious thing in the chief's world, and she'd been found on a white rancher's property, unconscious and clearly cared for by the enemy. Samuel stood in his doorway, watching 5 armed warriors approach his cabin, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. The girl stirred behind him, awakening to the sound of familiar voices calling her name in their native tongue. What Samuel didn't know was that Chief Running Bear had spent the last 4 days convinced his daughter was dead. The war party that rode toward the Creek Ranch wasn't coming to rescue a lost child. They were coming to avenge what they believed was her murder. And in their minds, Samuel Creek wasn't a good Samaritan who'd saved a dying girl. He was the white devil who'd killed a chief's daughter and needed to pay the ultimate price. Chief Running Bear dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his entire life in the saddle. His moccasins hit the ground without a sound, but the weight of his presence seemed to shake the very foundations of Samuel's cabin. The other 4 warriors remained mounted, forming a semicircle that blocked any possible escape route. Their faces were masks of controlled fury, war paint streaking their cheeks like dried blood. Samuel forced himself to stay calm as the chief approached, each step deliberate and measured. This wasn't a man who acted in haste or anger. This was a leader who calculated every move, every word, every consequence before committing to action, which somehow made him infinitely more dangerous than a hothead looking for a fight. The chief stopped just beyond arm's reach, close enough that Samuel could see the intricate tattoos covering his chest, the eagle feathers woven into his hair, the ceremonial knife at his belt that had probably taken more lives than Samuel could count. When Running Bear spoke, his English was perfect, each word chosen with surgical precision. "White man, you have something that belongs to me." Samuel's throat felt like sandpaper, but he managed to find his voice. "Your daughter is safe. She's inside, sleeping. She was dying of thirst when I found her." Running Bear's dark eyes never left Samuel's face, searching for deception, for weakness, for any sign that this white rancher was lying. "You found her, or you took her." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Samuel could feel the other warriors tensing, hands moving closer to their weapons. One wrong word, one misinterpreted gesture, and this conversation would end in violence. "She came to my water trough," Samuel said carefully. "Collapsed from exhaustion. I gave her water, food, a place to rest. Nothing more." Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. The girl emerged, rubbing sleep from her eyes, still wrapped in Samuel's blanket. When she saw her father, her face lit up with pure joy, and she ran toward him with the unsteady steps of someone still recovering from near death. But instead of the reunion Samuel expected, Chief Running Bear caught his daughter and immediately began examining her for injuries, his weathered hands checking her arms, her face, her clothing. He spoke to her in rapid bursts of their native language, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. The girl responded just as quickly, gesturing toward Samuel, toward the cabin, miming the act of drinking water and eating food. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he could read the tone, the body language, the way she kept pointing at him while speaking earnestly to her father. Chief Running Bear's expression shifted as he listened, the rigid mask of anger giving way to something more complex. Confusion, perhaps, or suspicion of a different kind. When his daughter finished speaking, the chief stood slowly and faced Samuel again. "She tells me you could have taken advantage of her weakness, that you could have demanded payment for your help, that you could have used her as a bargaining tool against her people." The chief's voice carried no warmth, but the homicidal edge had dulled slightly. "Yet you did none of these things." Samuel nodded, not trusting himself to speak without saying something that might trigger violence. "This presents a problem," Running Bear continued. "My warriors expected to find their chief's daughter held captive by white devils. They expected to paint their faces with enemy blood and return home with scalps and stories of vengeance." One of the mounted warriors spoke sharply in their language, his voice rising with what sounded like disagreement. The chief responded without taking his eyes off Samuel, but the exchange had an edge to it that made Samuel's skin crawl. There was dissent in the ranks. Not all of these warriors were convinced that mercy had been shown. The warrior who'd spoken dismounted and strode forward, his war paint more elaborate than the others, his weapons more ornate. When he spoke again, this time in broken English, his words dripped with contempt. "White man lies. White man steals child, feeds her poison, makes her speak false words to protect him." Chief Running Bear held up one hand, a gesture that stopped the warrior mid-sentence. "Broken Wing, you will not speak again unless I give permission." But Broken Wing wasn't backing down. He continued in their native tongue, his voice growing louder, more insistent. The other warriors began shifting in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. Samuel could see the careful discipline that had marked their arrival beginning to fracture. The girl, still clinging to her father's leg, suddenly stepped forward and began speaking directly to Broken Wing. Her young voice cut through the tension like a blade, and Samuel watched as the warrior's expression shifted from rage to uncertainty. Whatever she was saying, it was having an impact. Chief Running Bear translated quietly, his voice thoughtful. "She is telling him exactly what happened, how she became lost during the storm 3 nights ago, how she wandered for days without food or water, growing weaker with each step, how she expected to die alone on the prairie until she saw your ranch." The girl continued speaking, her voice growing stronger, more passionate. She pointed at Samuel, then at herself, then mimed the actions of drinking and eating. Even the warriors who couldn't understand her words were listening now, drawn in by the conviction in her tone. "She is telling them about your family," the chief continued, surprise evident in his voice. "She says she saw the photograph of your wife and child on your table. She says she could see the sadness in your eyes when you looked at it. She says you helped her because you understood loss, not because you wanted to harm our people." Samuel felt his throat tighten. The girl had seen more than he'd realized, understood more than he'd given her credit for. In his darkest moment of grief 3 winters ago, when fever had taken everything that mattered to him, he'd never imagined that pain could someday become a bridge between enemies. Broken Wing's lance lowered slightly, but his face still showed doubt. He spoke again, this time directly to the girl, and Samuel caught one word he recognized, a term that wasn't friendly. The girl's response was immediate and fierce. She stepped closer to Broken Wing and spoke with such intensity that several warriors actually leaned back in their saddles. Her words came rapid fire, passionate, unwavering in their conviction. "She is asking him if he has children," Running Bear translated, amazement creeping into his voice. "She is asking him what he would want a stranger to do if his child was dying of thirst in the wilderness." Broken Wing's lance dropped to his side completely. The girl wasn't finished. She turned to address all the warriors now, her voice carrying across the ranch like a battle cry. Samuel could see the effect rippling through the group as hard faces began to soften, as weapons were slowly lowered. "She is telling them that judging you for showing mercy would make us no better than the soldiers who kill without asking questions," Running Bear continued. "She is saying that if we punish kindness, we become the monsters that white men believe us to be." The silence that followed was deafening. 5 warriors sat motionless on their horses, processing the words of an 8-year-old girl who just challenged everything they thought they knew about justice and revenge. Finally, Broken Wing spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Running Bear's translation came slowly, thoughtfully. He says that perhaps the Spirit sent us a teacher instead of an enemy. He says that maybe wisdom sometimes comes from the smallest voices." Samuel felt something shift in the air around them. The tension wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something else. Understanding, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. Chief Running Bear looked at Samuel with what might have been the beginning of respect. "My daughter has just done something remarkable. She has turned a war party into a council of peace. But this creates a new problem." Samuel's heart sank. "What kind of problem?" "My warriors cannot return to our village empty-handed. They cannot tell their wives and children that we rode out expecting battle and came back with nothing but words." The chief gestured toward his men, who were now engaged in heated discussion among themselves. "Some believe that any white man who touches a member of our tribe, for any reason, must face consequences. They think I am showing weakness by talking instead of taking action." The sound of arguing voices grew louder. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. These warriors had come here expecting blood, and disappointment could quickly turn into a different kind of violence. "There is only one way to satisfy both justice and mercy," Running Bear said, his dark eyes boring into Samuel's soul. "But it will require something from you that may be harder than dying." Samuel's mouth went dry as desert sand. "What do you need from me?" Chief Running Bear studied him for a long moment, weighing words that could determine whether peace or war would follow this encounter. "You must come with us to our village. You must stand before our tribal council and tell your story to the elders who have spent their entire lives learning to hate your people." The world seemed to tilt beneath Samuel's feet. He'd heard stories about what happened to white men who entered native villages. Most of those stories ended with scalping, torture, or worse. But looking into the chief's eyes, Samuel saw something unexpected. Not malice, but a kind of desperate hope. "If I refuse," Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer, "then my warriors will assume you helped my daughter for selfish reasons, that you expected payment or reward, and they will take justice into their own hands right here, right now." Running Bear glanced toward his men, where the arguments were growing more heated by the minute. Some of them already believed this was all a trap, that you planned to use her as leverage against our tribe. One of the warriors, a young man with fresh scars across his chest, suddenly shouted something in their language and pointed his lance directly at Samuel. The others immediately fell silent, turning to watch their chief's response. Running Bear spoke sharply to the young warrior, his voice carrying absolute authority. But Samuel could see the challenge in the young man's posture, the way he held his weapon, the defiance burning in his eyes. This wasn't over. "Swifthawk believes you are lying about everything," the chief translated quietly. "He thinks you stole my daughter days ago and only returned her when you saw our war party approaching. He wants to settle this the old way." The old way. Samuel had heard enough frontier stories to know what that meant. Trial by combat. A fight to the death that would prove innocence or guilt through strength and skill rather than words and evidence. The girl tugged on her father's sleeve and spoke urgently, her young voice cutting through the tension like a knife. But this time, her words seemed to have less effect. Swifthawk responded angrily, his lance never wavering from Samuel's chest. "What's he saying?" Samuel asked. Running Bear's expression darkened. "He says a white man's kindness is like a snake's smile, beautiful until it strikes. He says the only way to know your true heart is to spill your blood on sacred ground." More warriors were nodding now, swept up in Swifthawk's rhetoric. Samuel could see the careful unity that Running Bear had maintained beginning to crack. The chief was losing control of his own men, and that loss of control could turn deadly in seconds. But then the girl did something that stunned everyone. She walked directly to Swifthawk's horse and placed her small hand on the animal's neck, speaking in clear, ringing tones that carried across the entire ranch. Her words weren't pleading or begging. They carried the unmistakable authority of someone who expected to be heard. Swifthawk's lance began to waver. Other warriors leaned forward in their saddles, straining to catch every word. Even Running Bear looked surprised by his daughter's boldness. She is invoking the law of sacred debt," the chief whispered, amazement thick in his voice. "She is claiming that your act of mercy has created a bond that cannot be broken by violence." The girl continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. She pointed to the water trough where Samuel had found her, then to the cabin where he'd given her food and shelter, then finally to Samuel himself. "She is telling them that to harm you would be to dishonor the gift of life you gave her," Running Bear translated. "She says that the spirits themselves guided her to your ranch, and that killing you would be like spitting in the face of divine will." Swifthawk lowered his lance completely, but his face still showed stubborn resistance. He spoke again, this time in a tone that sounded almost pleading. "He asks how we can trust any white man when so many of his kind have brought nothing but death to our people," the chief explained. "He reminds us of the massacre at Willow Creek, where soldiers killed women and children under a flag of truce." The girl's response was immediate and passionate. She gestured toward the photograph visible through Samuel's open cabin door, then placed her hand over her heart, speaking words that seemed to come from her very soul. "She says that this man knows the same grief we know," Running Bear said softly. "She says that loss has made him understand what it means to cherish life, not destroy it." The argument continued for several more minutes, with other warriors joining the debate. Samuel stood frozen in place, knowing that his fate was being decided in a language he couldn't understand. But gradually he began to notice a shift in the tone of the discussion. The angry shouts became thoughtful murmurs. Weapons that had been raised in threat were slowly lowered. Finally, Running Bear raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of final judgment. "It is decided. You will come with us to face the Council of Elders, but not as a prisoner, as a guest under the protection of my daughter's sacred debt." The chief's eyes bored into Samuel's. "Do you understand what this means?" Samuel shook his head, afraid to guess. "It means that any harm that comes to you will be considered an attack on my family's honor. It means that my warriors will defend your life as fiercely as they would defend mine." Running Bear paused, letting the implications sink in. "But it also means that if the council finds you guilty of deception, the punishment will be far worse than a quick death here on your ranch." The choice was no choice at all, really. Stay and face the wrath of warriors who thought he was lying, or trust his life to strangers who had every reason to hate his kind. But looking at the girl's earnest face, at the way she'd fought for him against her own people, Samuel knew what he had to do. "I'll come," he said simply. Running Bear nodded, as if he'd expected no other answer. "Gather what you need for several days' travel. We leave within the hour." As Samuel moved toward his cabin to pack, the girl ran up beside him and slipped her small hand into his. She spoke a single word in English, the first he'd heard from her lips. Safe. Whether she was promising his safety or asking for reassurance about her own, Samuel couldn't tell. But something in her touch, in the trust shining from her dark eyes, gave him strength for whatever lay ahead. Because he was about to enter a world where white men were enemies by definition, where mercy was often seen as weakness, and where the wrong word or gesture could mean the difference between life and death. He was about to face judgment from people who had watched their children die from diseases brought by his kind, who had seen their land stolen and their sacred places desecrated. But he was going there under the protection of a child who decided his life was worth defending, and somehow that made all the difference. The ride to the village would take 2 days through territory Samuel had never seen, along paths known only to the tribes. 2 days to wonder if he was riding toward redemption or destruction. 2 days to hope that kindness shown to one lost child might be enough to bridge decades of hatred and mistrust. 2 days to discover whether mercy truly could triumph over the endless cycle of revenge that had stained this frontier with blood. The journey to the village began at first light, with Samuel riding between 2 warriors while Chief Running Bear and his daughter led the procession. The girl had insisted on riding double with her father, but she kept turning in the saddle to watch Samuel, as if making sure he was still there, still safe under her protection. The landscape changed dramatically as they traveled deeper into tribal territory. Rolling prairie gave way to dense forest, then to rocky canyons that seemed to swallow sound itself. Samuel had lived on the frontier for 2 decades, but he'd never seen country like this. Hidden trails wound between towering stone formations, past sacred groves where ancient trees bore markings he couldn't decipher. This wasn't just unfamiliar territory. This was a secret world, carefully concealed from white eyes for generations. Every mile they traveled took Samuel further from everything he'd known, deeper into a realm where his very existence was an intrusion. Swift Hawk rode directly behind him, close enough that Samuel could feel the young warrior's hostile gaze boring into his back. The others maintained professional distance, but their body language spoke volumes. Hands rested casually on weapon hilts. Eyes constantly scanned for threats. They were escorting him, not accompanying him, and the distinction was crystal clear. By midday, the silence had become oppressive. The only sounds were hoofbeats on stone, leather creaking, and the occasional word exchanged between the warriors in their native tongue. Samuel found himself studying the intricate tattoos covering their arms, the way they moved with their horses as if they'd been born in the saddle, the casual competence with which they navigated terrain that would have challenged his best efforts. These weren't the savage raiders described in territorial newspapers. These were skilled horsemen, expert trackers, men who understood this land in ways Samuel never would. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. When they stopped at midday to rest the horses, the girl approached Samuel with a handful of dried meat and berries. She spoke softly in her language, then switched to broken English. "Eat, long ride still." Samuel accepted the food gratefully, surprised by its rich flavor. "Thank you. What's your name? What should I call you?" She smiled, the first genuine expression of joy he'd seen since they'd left his ranch. "Morning Star. Father says I born when sky caught fire with dawn colors." Morning Star. It suited her perfectly. Samuel had watched her transform from a dying child at his water trough into a fierce advocate who'd stood up to grown warriors. There was something luminous about her, something that seemed to burn brighter in moments of crisis. Morning Star is a beautiful name, Samuel said. I'm Samuel Creek. She nodded solemnly. Samuel means heard by God, yes? Father knows white man names, says Samuel was prophet who spoke truth when kings wanted lies. The observation caught Samuel off guard. This 8-year-old girl not only knew biblical history, but understood its relevance to their current situation. How many assumptions had he made about her people based on ignorance and prejudice? Chief Running Bear approached, his expression unreadable. My daughter has taken great interest in your welfare, Samuel Creek. This is unusual. She does not typically trust strangers, especially not white strangers. Samuel looked down at Morning Star, who was now sitting cross-legged beside him, carefully braiding grass stems with the focused concentration of a master craftsman. She's remarkable, brave beyond her years. Brave, yes, but also stubborn. The chief's mouth quirked in what might have been paternal amusement. She has informed me that if the council decides against you, she will invoke the right of family adoption. Do you understand what this means? Samuel shook his head, though something in the chief's tone suggested he wasn't going to like the answer. It means she would claim you as her brother, making you a member of our tribe with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Running Bear's dark eyes bored into Samuel's, including the obligation to take up arms against your own people if called upon to do so. The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. Morning Star wasn't just offering him protection. She was offering him a complete transformation of identity, a severing of ties to everything he'd ever known. The gesture was both incredibly generous and impossibly complex. She's thought this through? Samuel asked. She has thought of little else since we left your ranch. The chief settled into a crouch beside them, his weathered face grave. But you should know that such adoption has never been offered to a white man, ever. The council may reject her request entirely. Swift Hawk had been listening to this conversation with growing agitation. He strode over and spoke rapidly in their language, his voice rising with each word. Other warriors began drifting closer, drawn by the intensity of the exchange. What's he saying? Samuel asked, though the young warrior's body language made his objections clear enough. He believes my daughter has been bewitched by white man's magic. He thinks you used some kind of sorcery to make her defend you. Running Bear's voice remained level, but Samuel could see tension building in his jaw. He is demanding that I forbid her from speaking at the council meeting. Morning Star looked up from her grass braiding, her young face blazing with indignation. She spoke a single word in their language that made Swift Hawk take an involuntary step backward. What did she say? Samuel whispered. Running Bear's lips twitched with suppressed amusement. She called him a fool who mistakes wisdom for witchcraft. In our culture, such directness from a child to a warrior is unprecedented. The standoff stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Swift Hawk's hand moved toward his knife, but before he could draw it, another voice cut through the tension. An elderly warrior, his hair completely white, and his face mapped with the lines of countless battles, spoke from where he sat beneath a gnarled oak tree. His words carried the authority of age and experience, causing every other warrior to fall silent. Elder Stone Bear says we waste time with arguments that have no answers, Running Bear translated. He says the council fire will burn away all lies and reveal all truths. He reminds us that the spirits will guide the elders to wisdom, regardless of what any of us believe. The rebuke was gentle but effective. Swift Hawk stepped back, his face flushed with embarrassment at being corrected by an elder. The other warriors began moving toward their horses, clearly recognizing that the rest period was over. As they prepared to continue their journey, Morning Star tugged on Samuel's sleeve and spoke urgently in her language. Her father listened, then nodded gravely. She wants you to know something about the council meeting, Running Bear said. There will be tests. Not just questions, but challenges designed to reveal your character. Some will try to make you angry, to see if you respond with violence. Others will offer you things you want, to see if you can be corrupted. Samuel felt his stomach tighten. What kind of tests? That depends on the elders. Each has their own methods for reading a man's heart. The chief mounted his horse with fluid grace, settling Morning Star in front of him. But I will tell you this. The truth is your strongest weapon. Even when it hurts. Even when it makes you look weak or foolish. The elders have spent decades learning to recognize deception in all its forms. The afternoon portion of their journey took them through increasingly dramatic terrain. Narrow passes between towering cliffs, where the sound of hoofbeats echoed like thunder. Hidden valleys carpeted with wildflowers that seemed to exist in their own private world. Ancient petroglyphs carved into rock faces, telling stories Samuel couldn't read, but somehow understood on a visceral level. This was more than just travel. It was initiation, a gradual introduction to secrets that white men had spent generations trying to uncover. Every mile revealed new wonders, new proof that the stereotypes and assumptions of his own culture were built on willful ignorance. As evening approached, they crested a ridge and Samuel saw their destination spread out in the valley below. The village was larger than he'd expected, with dozens of lodges arranged in careful patterns around central gathering areas. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played in the spaces between dwellings, and the whole scene radiated the comfortable familiarity of home. But what struck Samuel most was the absence of defensive walls or fortifications. This wasn't a military encampment or a fortress built to withstand siege. It was a community, a place where families lived and children grew up and elders shared wisdom around evening fires. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years thinking of these people as savage raiders who lived for violence and war. Instead, he was looking at what appeared to be a more peaceful settlement than most of the towns he'd known. Their arrival had been noticed. People began emerging from lodges, gathering in small groups to watch the procession descend into the valley. Samuel could see curiosity in their faces, but also wariness. Word had apparently spread about their unusual guest. Children ran alongside their horses as they entered the village proper, chattering excitedly in their language. Some pointed at Samuel with undisguised fascination. Others hung back, staying close to their parents with the natural caution of youth confronted with something unfamiliar. Morning Star waved at the children from her perch in front of her father, calling out greetings that were answered with obvious affection. Whatever else happened during his time here, Samuel realized he was witnessing something precious. A little girl returning safely home to people who loved her. They stopped in front of a large lodge decorated with intricate paintings that seemed to tell stories of great hunts and battles. Running Bear dismounted and helped his daughter down, speaking quietly to several adults who'd gathered to welcome them back. An elderly woman, her gray hair braided with colorful beads and her dress adorned with complex geometric patterns, approached Morning Star with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The reunion between grandmother and granddaughter was wordless but profound, speaking to bonds that transcended language or culture. "My mother," Running Bear explained to Samuel. "She has not slept since Morning Star disappeared." She blamed herself for not watching more carefully. Samuel watched the emotional reunion with a mixture of joy and growing apprehension. These people had suffered real anguish over Morning Star's disappearance. They'd feared the worst, prepared for tragedy, mobilized search parties to scour hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The relief and gratitude in their faces was genuine and overwhelming. But tomorrow, when the council convened, that same emotional investment could work against him. If even one elder suspected he'd caused Morning Star's ordeal rather than ending it, their natural protective instincts would demand justice of the most severe kind. Elder Stone Bear, who'd spoken with such authority during their rest stop, approached Samuel with measured steps. His ancient eyes studied every detail of Samuel's appearance, from his worn boots to his weathered hat. When he finally spoke, his English was accented but clear. White man who helps lost children. This is new thing in my long life. The elder's voice carried no hostility, but no warmth either. Tomorrow we learn if new thing is good thing or dangerous thing. Before Samuel could respond, the elder had turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his doubts and fears. Around him, the village continued its evening routines. Families gathered for meals, children played their final games before darkness fell. Adults tended to the countless small tasks that kept a community functioning. It was achingly normal, achingly human. And tomorrow, Samuel would have to convince these people that despite everything their experience had taught them about his kind, he was worthy of their trust. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just his own life, but the fragile possibility that mercy might triumph over mistrust, that understanding might bridge the chasm between two peoples who'd spent generations seeing each other as enemies. As night settled over the village and stars began appearing in the vast western sky, Samuel found himself praying to whatever forces governed justice and truth. Tomorrow would reveal whether one man's simple act of kindness could change the trajectory of an entire conflict, or whether some wounds ran too deep for even the purest intentions to heal. The trial began at dawn, when the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern mountains gold and crimson. Samuel had barely slept, tossing restlessly on the buffalo hide bed provided in the guest lodge, his mind churning with possibilities both hopeful and terrifying. When the summons came, delivered by a young warrior whose painted face revealed nothing, Samuel knew his fate would be decided within the next few hours. The council lodge stood at the heart of the village, larger than any structure Samuel had ever seen among the tribes. 7 elders sat in a perfect semicircle around a central fire, their weathered faces grave in the dancing shadows. Each wore the ceremonial regalia of their position: eagle feathers, intricate beadwork, bear claws, and sacred stones that spoke of decades spent guiding their people through crisis and triumph. Samuel entered the lodge with Chief Running Bear beside him and Morning Star walking determinedly at his other side. The child had insisted on attending despite her father's gentle protests, and Samuel could see why. Her presence changed the entire dynamic of the gathering. These weren't just tribal elders deciding the fate of a white intruder. They were community leaders considering the passionate plea of one of their own children. The eldest member of the council, a man so ancient his skin seemed translucent in the firelight, gestured for Samuel to stand in the center of the circle. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of countless winters and summers, of wisdom earned through experiences Samuel could barely imagine. Running Bear translated quietly. "Elder Crow Feather says you stand in the place where truth and lies battle for supremacy. He says the spirits of our ancestors gather here to witness your words. He asks if you understand the sacred nature of what happens next." Samuel nodded, his throat dry as desert sand. "I understand." The questions began immediately, delivered in rapid succession by different elders, each probing a different aspect of his story. How had he known Morning Star was dying? What had he hoped to gain by helping her? Why hadn't he immediately sought out her people? Had he touched her inappropriately? Had he threatened her in any way? Samuel answered each query honestly, even when the truth made him look foolish or naive. He admitted that he'd acted on instinct rather than calculated thought. He acknowledged that he'd been frightened when the war party arrived, that he'd considered hiding Morning Star or lying about her presence. He confessed that he'd never questioned his own people's attitudes toward the tribes until forced to confront his prejudices face to face. But it was the 7th elder, a stern-faced woman whose gray hair was braided with silver ornaments, who asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "White man speaks of mercy," she said through Running Bear's translation. "But white man's people show no mercy to our children, our women, our elders. White soldiers kill without asking if victim is warrior or innocent. White settlers take land without asking if it is sacred or profane. Why should we believe that one white man is different from all the others?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from burning sage. Samuel could feel the weight of generations of broken promises, massacred villages, stolen children, and desecrated burial grounds pressing down on him. How could he answer for crimes he'd never committed but had certainly benefited from? How could he claim moral superiority when his own culture had written its expansion in the blood of innocents? Before he could formulate a response, Morning Star stepped forward. She spoke directly to the female elder, her young voice clear and unwavering despite the enormity of the moment. Her words flowed like music, punctuated by gestures toward Samuel, toward her own heart, toward the sacred fire burning at the center of the lodge. The effect was immediate and startling. The stern-faced elder's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Other council members leaned forward, caught up in whatever story Morning Star was telling. Even the ancient crow feather nodded slowly, as if recognizing truth in the child's passionate testimony. "She tells them about the photograph," Running Bear whispered to Samuel. "About the grief she saw in your eyes when you looked at the picture of your dead family. She says that pain recognizes pain, that loss teaches compassion in ways that comfort never can." Morning Star continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. She gestured toward the water gourd hanging from one of the lodge poles, then mimed the act of drinking with desperate thirst. She pointed to herself, then to Samuel, then clasped her hands together in a gesture that needed no translation. "She says that when someone is dying of thirst, the color of the hand offering water doesn't matter," the chief translated. "She says that kindness has no tribe, no nation, no skin color. She says it simply is, like sunlight or rain or the wind that blows across all lands equally." The female elder spoke again, this time directly to Morning Star. The exchange was brief but intense, with the adult clearly challenging something the child had claimed. Morning Star's response was immediate and fierce, delivered with the conviction of someone who'd witnessed truth firsthand. Elder Silver Moon asks if Morning Star truly believes you would risk your life again to help another child from our tribe. Running Bear explained. Morning Star says yes, without hesitation. She says she could see it in the way you moved, the way you spoke, the way you looked at her. Not as an enemy to be feared, but as a person to be helped. The council deliberated for what felt like hours, speaking in low voices that made translation impossible. Samuel stood in the center of their circle, acutely aware that his life hung in the balance of words he couldn't understand. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling toward the smoke hole above, carrying his hopes and fears into the vast sky beyond. Finally, Elder Crow Feather raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his ancient voice carried the finality of absolute judgment. "The council has reached its decision," Running Bear translated, his own voice tight with emotion. "They have considered the testimony of my daughter, the evidence of your actions, and the wisdom of our ancestors who teach that mercy begets mercy, hatred begets hatred." Samuel held his breath, knowing that the next words would either grant him life or condemn him to death. "You are found to be truthful in your testimony. Your actions toward Morning Star are judged to be those of a man following the path of honor, regardless of the color of his skin or the crimes of his people." The chief paused, clearly struggling with the weight of what he was translating. "You are granted not only your life, but something far more precious, the friendship of our tribe." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, but not of violence, of overwhelming relief and gratitude. He felt his knees go weak, his vision blur with tears he hadn't realized were building. Around him, the elders nodded gravely, their judgment rendered and accepted. But Elder Silver Moon wasn't finished. She spoke again, this time at length, her words carrying ceremonial weight that made the other council members sit straighter in their positions. "Elder Silver Moon says that friendship carries obligations as well as privileges," Running Bear continued. "She says you will be welcome in our village at any time, that our warriors will defend you as they would defend their own brothers. But she also says you must become a bridge between our peoples, helping both sides understand that enemies can become allies when they choose courage over fear." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Samuel had ever witnessed. Each elder approached him individually, placing their hands on his shoulders while speaking words of welcome and acceptance. Sacred smoke was wafted over him with eagle feathers, blessing him with protection and wisdom. Morning Star presented him with a necklace of carved bone and turquoise, her small hands trembling with the importance of the moment. But the most profound moment came when Chief Running Bear stepped forward with an ornate tomahawk decorated with silver inlay and eagle feathers. The weapon was clearly ancient, its handle worn smooth by generations of hands. "This belonged to my grandfather and his grandfather before him," the chief said, his voice thick with emotion. "It has never been carried by anyone not born to our tribe. Until today." As Samuel accepted the tomahawk, feeling its perfect balance and the weight of its history, he understood that he was being given far more than a weapon. He was being entrusted with a legacy, a responsibility to honor the trust these people had placed in him. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Drums echoed across the valley as the entire village gathered to welcome their unexpected new brother. Children who'd been shy during his arrival now approached with curious smiles, offering him tastes of traditional foods and teaching him words in their language. Adults shared stories of their own encounters with white settlers, some tragic, some hopeful, all honest in ways that challenged Samuel's assumptions about both cultures. As the festivities wound down and people began drifting back to their lodges, Morning Star found Samuel sitting alone by the dying council fire. She settled beside him, her young face serious in the fading light. "You sad?" she asked in her careful English. Samuel considered the question. Was he sad? Overwhelmed, certainly. Humbled beyond measure, absolutely. But sad? "No," he said finally. "Not sad. Grateful, and maybe a little scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that I won't be worthy of what your people have given me. Scared that I'll fail when you need me to be a bridge between our worlds." Morning Star was quiet for a long moment, staring into the glowing embers of the sacred fire. When she finally spoke, her words carried wisdom far beyond her years. "Father says bridge not built in one day. Says bridge built one stone at a time, with much patience and strong hands." She looked up at Samuel with those dark eyes that had first captured his compassion. "You already place first stone when you give water to dying girl. Now we place more stones together until bridge strong enough for many people to cross safely." 3 days later, Samuel rode back toward his ranch, but he wasn't alone. A small escort of warriors accompanied him, led by Swifthawk, who had requested the honor of ensuring Samuel's safe return. The young warrior who'd once wanted to kill him now rode beside him as a brother. Their earlier conflict transformed into mutual respect through the alchemy of understanding. The transformation in Swifthawk had been remarkable to witness. During the council's deliberation, he'd approached Samuel privately and admitted that his hostility had been born from grief over his own sister's death at the hands of cavalry soldiers. Seeing Morning Star safely returned, hearing her passionate defense of the white man who'd saved her, had forced him to confront the difference between justice and vengeance. As they crested the final ridge before Samuel's ranch, Swifthawk spoke in careful English. "When bad things happen between our peoples, you remember this day. Remember that not all hearts filled with hate. Remember that some bridges strong enough to carry hope across divide." Samuel's ranch looked exactly as he'd left it, but everything felt different. The simple cabin, the weathered barn, the water trough where he'd first encountered Morning Star, all were the same, yet somehow transformed by the knowledge that he was no longer just a lonely rancher scratching out existence on hostile frontier. He was a bridge builder, a peacemaker, a man entrusted with the sacred responsibility of proving that understanding could triumph over fear. The warriors departed with traditional farewells, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts and his dramatically changed perspective on the world. But he wasn't destined to remain alone for long. Word of what had happened spread through the territorial community with the speed of wildfire, bringing visitors both welcome and unwelcome to his door. Some came seeking his perspective on tribal negotiations, hoping to leverage his unique relationship for commercial advantage. Others arrived with suspicion and hostility, viewing his acceptance by the tribe as evidence of treason or collaboration with the enemy. A few, precious few, came with genuine curiosity about the possibility that peaceful coexistence might be achievable between settler and tribal communities. Each visitor forced Samuel to practice the bridge-building role that Elder Silver Moon had described. With suspicious neighbors, he shared stories of the village's humanity, children playing games remarkably similar to those of white children, elders sharing wisdom that transcended cultural boundaries, families grieving their losses and celebrating their joys in ways any parent could understand. With those seeking commercial advantage, he emphasized the tribe's dignity and autonomy, their right to negotiate as equals rather than be exploited as resources. With genuine seekers after peace, he offered hope tempered by realism. Change was possible, but it would require courage, patience, and the willingness to see former enemies as fellow human beings. The most challenging visitor arrived 6 months after Samuel's return from the tribal village. Colonel James Morrison, commanding officer of the regional cavalry unit, rode up to the ranch with a full military escort and barely concealed hostility radiating from every line of his ramrod-straight posture. "Mr. Creek," the colonel said without dismounting, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a career soldier, "I'm here to discuss your recent associations with hostile tribal elements." Samuel stepped onto his porch, acutely aware of the tomahawk hanging at his belt and what it represented to this military man. "Colonel, what can I do for you? You can explain why a United States citizen is carrying Indian weapons and reportedly participating in savage ceremonies." Morrison's pale eyes fixed on the ceremonial tomahawk with undisguised disgust. Some might consider such behavior treasonous. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Samuel could see the soldiers behind Morrison shifting in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. This wasn't a social call or even an official inquiry. This was a confrontation that could easily turn violent. But before Samuel could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. A small group of riders appeared on the horizon, moving at a steady pace toward the ranch. As they drew closer, Samuel recognized the distinctive profile of Chief Running Bear, accompanied by Morning Star and 2 tribal elders. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more dangerous. Colonel Morrison's face went pale as he recognized the approaching party. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but Samuel stepped forward quickly. "Colonel, I'd like you to meet some friends of mine. Chief Running Bear, this is Colonel Morrison, commanding officer of the regional cavalry." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary diplomatic encounter in the territory's history. 2 men who should have been mortal enemies found themselves seated at Samuel's rough wooden table, sharing coffee and attempting to communicate through the bridge Samuel had unwittingly become. Morning Star, now 9 years old and even more articulate in English, served as an additional translator when cultural concepts proved too complex for direct interpretation. Her presence transformed the entire dynamic of the meeting. It was impossible to maintain military hostility toward an enemy leader when his daughter was carefully serving refreshments and chattering about the wildflowers she'd picked on the ride over. The conversation was stilted at first, heavy with the weight of generations of conflict and mistrust. But gradually, as Samuel facilitated exchanges about shared concerns, protecting families, maintaining peace, ensuring sufficient resources for survival, common ground began to emerge. Colonel Morrison learned that the recent cattle raids he'd attributed to hostile war parties were actually the work of renegade bands that Chief Running Bear was actively trying to control. The chief discovered that the cavalry's increased patrols weren't preparation for assault on the tribal village, but response to territorial demands for improved security following those same raids. By the time the sun set over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, 2 former enemies had begun the delicate process of becoming reluctant allies. It wasn't friendship. That would take years to develop, if it ever did. But it was understanding, and understanding was the foundation upon which peace could be built. The agreement they hammered out that evening was simple but revolutionary. Chief Running Bear would help track down the renegade raiders in exchange for Colonel Morrison's commitment to investigate settler grievances against the tribe before responding with military force. Samuel's ranch would serve as neutral ground where representatives of both sides could meet to address problems before they escalated into violence. As the tribal delegation prepared to depart, Morning Star hugged Samuel with the fierce affection of a sister saying goodbye to a beloved brother. In her careful English, she whispered words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Bridge getting stronger every day. Soon many people walk across safely, and no more children die from thirst on either side. Years later, when historians wrote about the peaceful resolution of the territorial conflicts that had plagued the region for decades, they would point to treaties and negotiations, to political leaders and military commanders who'd shown unusual wisdom in choosing diplomacy over warfare. But Samuel Creek knew the real truth. Peace had begun with something far simpler and far more profound. A cup of water offered to a dying child, and the courage to see enemies as human beings worthy of mercy. The bridge Morning Star had spoken of did indeed grow stronger with time. Other ranchers began following Samuel's example, offering aid to tribal members in distress rather than reaching for their rifles. Tribal leaders started bringing disputes to the neutral ground of Samuel's ranch, rather than settling them through raids and counter-raids. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. There were still incidents, still deaths on both sides, still those who preferred the familiar patterns of hatred to the uncertain work of peace-building. But slowly, steadily, the foundation was being laid for a different kind of relationship between two peoples who'd spent too many years seeing each other as monsters. Samuel Creek never became famous, never had towns named after him or statues erected in his honor. But he lived to see something far more valuable. Children from both cultures playing together without fear, families on both sides sleeping peacefully in their beds, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through violence, but through the simple courage to offer water to a thirsty stranger. Because in the end, that's all it took to change everything. One act of mercy, offered without expectation of reward, proving that the human heart recognizes no boundaries when it comes to compassion. And if you believe that small acts of kindness can still change the world, then you understand why Samuel Creek's story matters. Not because it's about the Old West or tribal conflicts or frontier justice, but because it's about the eternal truth that mercy begets mercy, understanding conquers fear, and bridges built one stone at a time can carry hope across any divide. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that courage and compassion can still triumph over hatred and fear, because the world needs more bridge builders now than ever. And click the video on your screen to discover another incredible story of unexpected heroism that proves ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they choose love over fear.